Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And on this episode of God Talk, I'm bringing back a congregational member that I had probably about 6 weeks ago on my podcast, and we had a great conversation about financial discussions, kind of like faith and finances. And it was kind of cool that even from that podcast. We had an individual that's not even connected to the church that reached out to Brian for some advice, and he was able to give some help. And so that's really what we want from these podcasts, that the practical, that they help and so forth. And last time Brian and I met, we were kind of just brainstorming maybe some follow-up podcasts that we could do. And I think he threw out the idea of financial forgiveness. And as soon as he said that, I love that, because from a spiritual perspective, from a pastoral counseling perspective, I find that there's a lot of forgiveness that needs to happen when it comes to finances. When I do counseling, that oftentimes can be an underlier of some significant relationship and marriage problems that people have. I remember when I was going through seminary and was being trained in different types of counseling, it was taught to us back at that time that the number one cause for divorce wasn't infidelity. It wasn't even a lack of communication. It was finances. And so I was kind of curious, almost 25, 30 years later, if that was still the same. And as I researched it this morning, it wasn't coming up as number one anymore, but it was always in the top three. So I know that finances are a big point of contention in relationships. And maybe you listening to this today, there is a need for forgiveness in your relationship because of finances. And I was just talking with Brian, and I'll bring him on here in a second, but I was telling him that, as I kind of thought through what are some different needs for forgiveness in relationships, part of it is maybe whoever's in charge of finances is racking up way too much debt. The other person's, trusting them that they're handling it, and they've overextended the family. Now they can't pay the bills. And now all of a sudden, you can't send your kids to the private school, or they can't be in select soccer. You're putting me on a budget. I can't buy what I want in the grocery store. And listen, it gets nasty. It gets nasty. From a biblical perspective, as a pastor, I believe it's ultimately the guy's role to provide for the family. So what I'll find oftentimes when I'm doing counseling and there's frustration over finances is the wife will be frustrated. I wish he would take a greater role in paying the bills and managing our money, and he's not. And potentially he's being content in her eyes and working a job that he's comfortable working, but he could really go out there and maybe try to find a new job that would pay more, that would provide for the family in a better way. Just bad decisions that are made financially. Some of those kind of go both ways, obviously. Maybe the wife goes out and has a spending problem, and that creates a need for a change in how you operate with your finances, and it calls for forgiveness. So like the tentacles of this can go in so many different directions. So at this point, I want to bring Brian in. Brian, thanks for coming back to the God Talk podcast.
Sure. Happy to be here.
And I know as we've talked, you've probably experienced this not so much in the same way that I have through counseling and through the church realm of things, but as someone who is a financial manager and you help a lot of people with financial issues, you've probably come across the fact that, because you brought up the topic, honestly, when we were talking offline about this a couple months ago. But what does financial forgiveness mean to you?
Well, I think it means just like any other form of forgiveness, right? It's acknowledging that, somebody did something that they perhaps shouldn't have, or went about it a wrong way. And with the assumption that person that did that is, willing to make a change and make adjustments and course corrections, it's letting that go.
And from your experience, how easy is it to make those changes and to let it go?
Gosh, man, in the financial vein, it's a different dynamic, I think, and I can talk about that. but it could be very hard because, when you're dealing with finances, it's like the answers aren't real clear,
Right.
and times change,
Right.
and so a lot of times I find people are like, is it me? And it's like, the past decade has been a lot different than previous decades. So, happy to go down some rabbit holes, but
Yeah. So it's curious that when you say times change, things are different. Obviously, all that stuff's true, especially too if it's not rooted in scripture. Like we know from scripture, regardless of the times, being materialistic and things like that aren't positive qualities. So I'm kind of curious as you help people and walk people through stuff like this, even though times change and things that people are doing are different. Do you ever, as you deal with people, touch on some of the timeless biblical truths?
absolutely. But I think on the onset of that, it really helps disarm people when you kind of acknowledge what is.
Right.
For instance, it's like, the ladder's kind of broken this day and age. I mean, used to, you could, back in the 80s, early 90s, even, you could go get a 4-year degree and get out, make a good income. Education was affordable.
Right.
Today, it's not nearly as affordable. And, I know a lot of college grads that are living at home with their parents.
Yeah.
Now that could be due to some other factors in addition to, but I still believe, the root answer is that the system doesn't work like it used to. I think, well, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. If the system's a problem, then there wouldn't be a need for forgiveness because then it's not their fault, though.
Yeah, but I think it's not necessarily that it's not impossible. It's just, to me, I think it makes sense to kind of help disarm some of the like, well, my parents did it this way, right? And it's like, well, there's some challenges today, that weren't here 20 years ago. I mean, look at the price of a house, right? This day and age, it's like 8 to 10 times your salary to buy a house, where not too terribly long ago, it was 3 to 4 times your salary, right? But everybody still thinks that they should have a nice house.
Right.
So how do you, I just think it's reasonable to acknowledge that together.
Yeah.
Wages haven't grown and kept up with inflation, right? So, I mean, my whole point there is not to say it's not your fault. It's just to acknowledge that it's not easy.
Right.
Right. And I think that initial like disarming, can kind of help encourage, both parties, right, to say, that's true,
Yeah, and I think disarming is good, but also, there's just people that make a lot of bad decisions and do things because everyone else is doing it when really they shouldn't. Like, I mean, I could take expensive vacations because other people do. I could buy $100,000 vehicles because right. And so, I mean, just because other people, my mom would always say, growing up in Buffalo, Gregory, just because someone goes over the Niagara Falls, does that mean you should? Right. So yeah, I do disarming when I talk to people too, but in the end, you disarm them too much, then they're not accountable. So to kind of get this going, you mentioned that you had a story a week ago when we were talking about setting up this of a kind of a powerful financial forgiveness story. Why don't you, if you're comfortable and are you able to share that story?
Well, I could share some of the high points from it, and it's actually a friend of a friend story as opposed to a client I'm working
Good.
with.
Yeah. Share that, and then we'll go on some rabbit holes after that.
Sure. So this guy, him and his wife are at odds and on a really rocky situation, and it's someone that I met several months ago and I've kept up with loosely, but ultimately the crux of it is he was irresponsible with his finances, and now that he's trying to make amends with his wife and deal with the consequences, it seems like, the problem is her unwillingness to forgive, and, like we started, right? It's like, to forgive someone, I believe that the forgivee needs to show that they are making changes. We call that repentance, right?
Right.
The forgiver, has a responsibility to, assuming that person has repented, to wipe the slate clean, essentially, right?
Right.
And so, in this particular case, it's like that's not happening, and that's really been. That was the point at which I was able to see that the problem is like, yeah, these financial issues, right? That was the, I guess, root, but at the end of the day, it's like, now this is also a problem.
Right.
And if we can't get past this problem, then to what you alluded to earlier, it's like in a lot of divorces today, finances are, the leading cause, because like once that becomes something that person's unable to forgive, then everything else, becomes in the spotlight, right? And all these other, imperfections of that person become big, bigger issues than they otherwise should, because this underlying thing, can't be gotten past.
So why do you think finances are more personal than the friends that you hang around with, or, some other things that might cause issues in relationships, but don't necessarily lead to divorce? What is it? I've got something in my mind. I'm kind of curious if it's, if you're thinking the same thing, but what makes finances so much more personal?
I think it's like, financial struggles often it's like, it's not really the root. It stems from, misaligned priorities rather than money itself, right? It's the way that society has kind of taught us to think about all these shiny objects, and so, I think a lot of it is just misaligned priorities within a relationship.
But specifically that the reason that it requires forgiveness, and there's lots of things that require forgiveness in a relationship. I'll just tell you what I'm thinking is I feel like with money, it's more personal because, one, there's a sense of betrayal, and then one party oftentimes feels like the other one's trying to control them through money.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree completely. Money's a tool, and it's most oftentimes not used perfectly.
Yeah. It's like, hey, honey, sorry, spent too much on this. Really probably shouldn't have bought the car. So, I need you to keep the grocery bill under such and such. Yeah, a lot of times it doesn't go over well.
Right. And it shouldn't,
right.
But it's, unfortunately, I mean, it probably happens all the time, right? I mean, it happens to me.
Yeah. All right. So I think in the remainder of the time that we've got in the podcast, I'd kind of like you to explore with us, what are some, I gave some examples of some things that require financial forgiveness. Like for the people that are listening, like I need you to get into their head, like, wow, like he's talking to me. Like when I preach, I like to hear people like, how'd you know? Like, I felt like you're talking to me. I do the best that you can to try to talk to the people that are listening to help them to understand, because they might not understand they're carrying bitterness in their hearts. Like there's a systemic problem in their marriage, and like you might be like shining light to it, where it's like, oh my gosh, I guess I am carrying around bitterness because my spouse did this or that or what have you, and then so I'd like you to try to identify some of those, and then if you've got any suggestions on how they can work that forgiveness route, I'd be interested in hearing that. But first of all, just what for the people that are listening, get into their heads a little bit. What are some things that they may need to find forgiveness for that they don't even realize?
Well, I mean, are we going under the assumption too that the person that's not being the most responsible with money has become responsible with money?
Potentially not. I mean, if they're becoming responsible, then I mean it's kind of cut and dry. You need to forgive them, clean slate, whatever. But what are some things that get them there?
I think a lot of it is just a unified front. I mean, have a unified budget. I think with
which is a solution. So before we get to the solutions and how we kind of can work forgiveness, I'm curious, like, let's just say someone in the household thinks he can do financial investing better than the investor, and he's lost $50,000, $100,000. It's like a form of gambling, right? Mm-hmm. What are some things that you've seen that really are wrong and should require some forgiveness, because assuming the person changes?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, you hit on a big one, right? It's like, treating money like you're at the casino, mm-hmm. right? And then what happens when you lose? You double down, then you do it again, right? I think in the investing world, there's a difference between investing and speculating.
Right.
Right. And sometimes investments go down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We all can kind of empathize with that,
right?
This day and age. But I think there's a difference between that and speculating. And I think that it's just being responsible with your investments, is super important. And take a long-term approach. Don't invest in speculative stuff, and have balance in your portfolio and be disciplined, right, with investing. But I think then too, you kind of get into spending.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that, the world has kind of taught us that, it's the whole keeping up with the Joneses theory. Right.
Or biblically coveting, right?
Yeah. So just kind of like being able to check yourself. Right. I mean, going back to like Matthew 6:24, it's like you can't have two masters, and recognizing that money is a tool and treating it with respect, but using it to glory God, not to appease yourself or help you keep up with the Joneses.
Right.
We don't deserve, to go on vacation after vacation and drive the newest, shiniest car and live in the biggest house. I mean, that's what America has led us to believe we do. But, what if that's not true?
I think if you're comfortable sharing, you've kind of learned some of that yourself, right? I mean, we've known each other for, 15 years, a long time. And I've never known you to be like overly materialistic, but you've shared with me like changes you've made in your own life, like, well, why should I spend that much on that? And just, can you talk a little bit about the benefits of making some of those changes where you're not so stretched and the stress it takes off you? And
yeah, sure. I mean, and that's just me, I mean, I've learned that, I do better without having nice things. Years ago, I bought a fancy truck, super fancy truck. And man, I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And all I could think about when I'm driving that is, yelling at my kid when she's eating a donut in the back seat, right?
Right. Yeah.
Just losing sleep at night because I get a door ding.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up selling the truck and just getting an older one, right?
Right.
And man, it's like I'm thrilled.
It's funny, the door ding. I was just having a conversation with someone, I'll keep it vague, that has a new vehicle, and he had gotten a door ding, and he was in a location where it happened, and he was really upset about the door ding, and so he wasn't able to stick around he had to go do something right there and then, so he couldn't stick around till the person came out. But he went and did what he needed to do, and he went back there and waited there until the person showed up to get the person's insurance so that the door ding could be paid for. And I just laughed at him when he told me that. I'm like, I used to get bothered by door dings. Now, like, I remember I was like, I think I was 16, and my grandpa had bought me a Ford Escort. And it was brand new, and so my mom, my stepdad was an NCO. My mom was a bookkeeper, made $10 an hour. We had no money, so it was such a blessing to be able to have a vehicle that I could get back and forth to school. And it was a nice car, it wasn't an expensive one, but it was brand new. And I remember my girlfriend and I went to, I think it was International Wildlife Park. In that car when it was new. And don't you know, one of these big old boys, one of these big old critters come out up to the road, they're trying to get food. And he turns his head and the horn just puts a nice little dent in the side of it. And at first I was like, I can't believe, but honestly, from that point on, I felt like God was saying, don't worry about the car. And so inevitably, when I get a new vehicle, I don't park at the far end of the parking lot. I don't intentionally try to get one, but I'll get one in the first, a month that I have the vehicle. And once I get it, I feel good because now it's out of the way and now I can just start driving the car.
Yeah, now it's broken in, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's true. And look, that's just my little tidbit for me. I mean, I'm not saying that nice things are not bad,
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's like, we all, not we all, but a lot of people dream, about getting that vacation home, getting that, whatever that is, right? Like retiring so they can go travel the world,
right.
And all these things. And it's like, a lot of times people retire and it's like, shortly thereafter, you're not, your health is in a state that you can't travel around the world. Right. Or you're like me and you get that fancy car and you realize that it's just driving you insane trying to keep it fancy.
Right.
And, in my experience, at least, it's like, I feel like a lot of that is distracting us from what really matters. And I think that as people, as believers, keeping kind of that idea, can kind of help check yourself,
Right.
as you set your ambitious goal. I think it's great to be ambitious, but it's like, ask yourself, like, what is motivating me? What's behind this? Is it to get that fancy thing, to have this fancy lifestyle, or is it to, to do a better job at, being the person that God wants me to be?
Right. Absolutely. All right. So let's just say, for the listener that's out there, they have some financial stress. They're not happy with where they're at. They've been working way too many years. They're still paycheck by paycheck. They're mad at their spouse over it. How would you encourage, if someone was coming to you, how would you encourage someone to start walking down the path of financial forgiveness? I mean, one of the things that you mentioned is repentance. So talk about that a little bit. But then, how do you change behavior? Like, repentance is you change behavior. So talk a little bit about, like, how do you do that? And something that can be so powerful and addictive as finances. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of it's, super dependent on, the specifics of any one situation. But, from a really high level, I think it's just about, taking the person who messed up, or the person who is being accused of messing up, is, looking to take responsibility for maybe some of the things that you did that you shouldn't have done, and not justifying it.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So oftentimes
I'm sorry, but
yeah, like well, the reason is, it's like, well, I think, look, I mean, I get it, life's weird, but at the end of the day, it's, stop justifying it. I think that's a big part, is just to kind of unwind what you did and just take ownership.
Right.
Look, we all, the finance world is so, I mean, we're all being marketed to constantly about things that sound like good ideas that are being sold to us as good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's reasonable to, be skeptical,
Right.
But I think that's a big first step, is kind of like just taking ownership,
right?
On the repentant side. And then, the person that's unhappy about the actions of the, alleged irresponsible financial person,
right?
You need to forgive them,
right?
And then there needs to be, I think, just, coming up with an action plan on, like, how are we going to do things in a way that's different than how we've done them in the past? Because without that, you're going to end up in the same hole.
Do you have some suggestions on that?
Yeah, I think, I think one of the first things is like, I've oftentimes, in a relationship, husband and wife or whatnot, it's reasonable to have, like, the husband handles these expenses and wife handles these expenses, right? It's right. Like, my wife does the grocery shopping and takes care of a lot of the kids' stuff and everything like that. She puts a gas in her car, and so, like, we've got, allocations that she manages, and I've got allocations that I manage, right?
Right.
But I think one thing that's important to do is to have a unified budget, to where you kind of share some of the things that are important to you and prioritize them, whether that's, going on vacation or fixing up the house or buying a house or getting a car, if I decided what the most important things in my life were financially without the input of my wife, how can I expect her not to be upset?
Right.
And vice versa.
So communication's a big key in this. Huge,
I think, having a meeting about, like, what does money mean to us? What does wealth mean to us? Because wealth too doesn't have to be all financial.
Right.
In all aspects, like the giving, just everything. I think that it's important to have some communal thought and agreement. And that could mean that there's concessions made.
Yeah. Probably has to have some concessions.
I think
give and take on both sides. Yeah.
I would assume so.
Yeah.
Feelings matter at the end of the day.
Right.
Especially when it comes to money and what we're going to do with it.
Yeah.
I think that's super important. I think, setting shared goals, praying together over finances, to reduce stress and build trust. I mean, it starts with transparency, right?
Yeah.
And I think those are some from a really high level, just really important little nuggets there. What do you think?
Yeah. I think you've touched on some good things. I was just thinking, listen, if you've got an addiction to porn, you can put, filters on your phone and your computer that keep you from going to those sites. You can make it so your friends can see what sites you're looking at. Like, there's just ways to kind of hold yourself accountable. I think communication is a huge key to move out of a financial hell and into a time of financial forgiveness, because communication, if you have strong communication, you can work through just about anything. But you also may not have the common sense or the resources to maybe even figure out what a good budget is and what really should matter, what shouldn't, how much should go towards debt, paying off debt, how much is savings. Dave Ramsey is big into, his method for doing some of that stuff. So I think some people probably do lack some of the basic knowledge for that. And that's where I think people like you are available to kind of guide and direct people in things like that. So, any suggestions you might want to give along those lines is great. And then also, I'll let you wrap it up with too, how can people get in touch with you? I can't remember how we did it last time, but I was glad to hear that at least one person did. So, maybe talk a little bit about how you might be able to help people.
Sure. I do think, kind of asking the barber if you need a haircut, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of bad financial advisors out there, but there's also a lot of great financial advisors out there. And I think that, when you look at like, what does a financial advisor do? Most people, in my experience, are like, yeah, they just help me make investments. But I think that, a real financial advisor is somebody that helps you make plans,
right?
And assign purpose to your money.
What would be, and I know you a lot of times just do things to help people, but someone's listening to this up and, man, I was looking like, I think there's 19 countries that in the last month people have listened to this. It makes me laugh because it's like, why, right? But it's kind of cool at the same time. So what would, like, I wouldn't know what is a fair dollar amount. Like, if you're going to use someone for investments, I get that, like, there may not be a charge for that. But like, if I'm going to use someone for financial counseling and financial advice to help me structure like the bigger picture more than just investments, because like I go to Google, like, how much should I pay per square foot for having flooring? And so, like, just because if you're not in the industry, you don't know. So someone's not around here, they can't just talk to you on the side and get maybe free advice. What's a reasonable amount?
It varies, and it's I'd say for putting together a financial plan, anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000.
Wow.
It's like going to see an attorney. You can have a will set. But I think that
which is tough because you're in financial difficulties, and then you might need to spend $5, $6, $7 grand.
Yeah. But I think that there's a lot of, I would assume that there's a lot of advisors out there willing to help people at a reasonable rate.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a lot of good, there's a lot of good books, and you can find information, if you're resourceful, right? I mean, like,
any books come to mind? I know you're a big reader.
Oh man. Yeah. There's I'm having your brain stumping me here, but I'll get back to you on the books. There's a handful of books that I think are good, but I think I even think sticking with, like, Dave Ramsey's FP Financial Peace University. He's got a lot of good books that are very high level, but I think for most folks, especially those that are in like financial turmoil, that's a really good place to start.
Right.
I mean, I think just establishing an emergency fund. I think one of the things that I talked about last time was that dual checking account system, where you have like your fixed expenses kind of set aside in one checking account, and then you have everything else go into your variable spending account,
right?
And ultimately that you're outside of your fixed expenses, your variable expenses have to fit within what's left, right? coming up with a plan to, pay off bad debt.
Right.
I think that's really important. And then what's really cool is that, when you put together a plan, if you do it whether you do it on Excel or you're using some software like I use, you can see a kind of a linear cash flow plan at the point that where you'll be able to start investing and ultimately have financial security and everything like that and be able to retire one day.
For sure.
And so, I think that,
hope's powerful. So to know that you can retire someday and be able to afford to is a powerful thing.
Yeah. So, I think it's just, baby steps, and it's a slow process. And, that I think I mentioned this on the other show that we did together. It's like that light at the end of the tunnel might be dark for a year, 2 years, 3 years, but it's just like anything else, right? Nothing good comes easy.
Right.
And I think working hard and working together.
So just because we got to wrap this up here pretty quick, if people have questions for you, especially since you can't remember those books on the spot, so that they can email you or contact you, what I know you're always open to it, but what's the best way for people to reach out?
Sure. My email is Brian, BRIAN, at foundationwealthpartners.com. Website's foundationwealthpartners.com. Check us out. You can contact me from there. Find me on LinkedIn, I'm here and listen, I'm always open to have conversations and, help point folks in the right direction, even if it's not necessarily a right fit for us to work together professionally.
Right. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming back on, Brian. I know we had a lot of listens to the last time that you're here. I know you've been able to help some people out, and just want to encourage all of you who are listening to this podcast. Forgiveness it's a necessary part of life, and it's powerful. But with forgiveness, there's got to be change. So if you struggle with this with your spouse and it's built up some walls, it needs to start with communication. Then potentially turn to the resources that can kind of help you turn the corner and make some more healthy decisions. Brian, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of God Talk, and I hope that you come back on again and share some more insight in the future.
Thanks for having me.
We look forward to seeing everyone again next week. God bless.